I see all those guitars behind you. Do you play?
Yeah.
That is fun. Well, it's such a pleasure to have you on God-Sized Stories. Dr. Barna, I'm a fan of your work for many years. Have used many of your researches in my writing through the years.
Okay.
So it's a true honor to talk to you.
Well, that's kind of you. Yeah, it's always great when somebody actually uses what we do. So thank you
That's
for
right.
doing that. Yeah.
Of course, yes. Well, I want to briefly introduce you, although you hardly need an introduction, but I want to just introduce you from my audience. You are you were the founder and the leader of the Barna Group, which for many years, which is a research company that has set the standards really for understanding trends in American culture. And today, Dr. George Barna is the director of research and co-founder of the Cultural Research Center at Arizona Christian University. He is also a professor there, having taught both undergraduate and graduate levels. And as a professor there, he focused on worldview assessment and development and cultural transformation. He's also a senior research and fellow at the Center for Biblical Worldview at the Family Research Council. And he has written over 50 books. Gosh, not 20, 50 books. 20 was a long time ago.
That's right.
And several of them are award winners and a New York Times bestseller. So we love to come to you and talk to you because you are definitely the biggest authority on Christian matters of faith research in this country. And anybody who writes the Christian world and beyond, they have relied on Dr. Barner's research through the years. I'm very grateful for your work. Very deep stuff. To read some of your researches, sometimes it's even overwhelming to see.
Well, it is for me too. So you're not alone in that. Yeah.
I am sure. Well, tell us a little bit about the Cultural Research Center that you founded in partnership with Arizona Christian University. Why was it created and what is its main goal?
There are a couple of things that we want to do. Arizona Christian University is really geared toward the idea of being able to transform culture with truth, God's truth. And in order to know that, you have to do your homework. You have to figure out what's going on in the culture so that you can have that kind of a positive impact on the culture. So the Cultural Research Center really is geared to keeping abreast of what's happening in our nation today, particularly trying to help Christian leaders, Christian parents, teachers to understand that world. Part of my contention, based on the 40 plus years of research I've done, is that the most important group to focus on are children, because that's when a person's worldview is developed. By the age of 13, the worldview that you're going to carry with you through the rest of your life has been largely developed. It doesn't tend to change much after that. So understanding the world to such a degree that you can help young people to be better decision makers in this culture of flux and chaos and confusion and an avalanche of information, that's really a key thing. I would say that the primary thing that we focus on at the Cultural Research Center is worldview. Every year we do an annual study of the worldview of Americans, and we produce a lot of information related to that because, I've been involved in 4 presidential elections as a pollster, a lot of other elections, helped the military, worked with major businesses around the country. Every domain of our culture I've been involved in as a researcher somehow. And a few years back, I was trying to figure out what really matters the most. How can we solve all the problems that we're facing? Because they seem so overwhelming. And the conclusion I came to after going back through a lot of our research studies and trying to figure out what did I learn from all of these, the one common trait they all had is that when you keep peeling away the layers of the onion to get to the real heart of the issue, it's all about worldview, because worldview is the basis on which people make every decision that they make. And so when we look at every problem that we're faced with in the nation, in our personal lives, in our families, in our churches. It's all about worldview. If you don't like where things are at, you've got to figure out what was the cumulative worldview that brought us to the conclusion that created that behavior or that belief. So we do a lot of measurement of worldview. That's really our heartbeat.
Mm. And I know that, of course, you provide a lot of research, but you also, this research center also has a mission to support educators, church leaders, and ministry partners, right? So how do you guys do that in a practical way?
A number of different things. We basically create resources that will try to explain and describe the research, what it means, what to do with it, why it's important. And so that will come in the form of news releases or mini reports. It'll come in the form of books. It'll come in the form of presentations. I spend a lot of time on the road speaking to different groups, trying to help them understand what we're discovering and what the implications are for their lives. And then we also have certain organizations that we believe really do have significant influence in our culture. And so we've come together, we've joined together with those groups, and we give our research to them, and we do regular meetings with them to try to dissect it for them, answer their questions about how it might impact what they're trying to do and enhance the influence that they already have. So those are some of the kinds of things we do, in addition to trying to integrate this into the classes that we teach at Arizona Christian University, at other universities, and particularly a lot of Christian schools around the country. I spend a lot of time speaking to educators working in Christian schools, K through 12, so that they have a better understanding of what's going on, not only in the lives of their students, but what would a biblical worldview look like in what they're teaching to those students.
Yeah, I love that because with all the research, the deep research that you do, it you can actually really tailor your curriculum, your books, and different things to really address the issues that arise from the research information that you gather, for all the data that you gather. So that's, I'm sure the resources are wonderful. So, but I want to talk about, since we're talking about worldview, we're going to talk about Christian biblical worldview and the state of Christianity in America since the pandemic, because that has been, of course, it's a very current issue right now. And there's no question that there has been a huge shift in the evangelical community since the pandemic. And you released a new study in partnership with the Cultural Research Center. And the title is Which Generation's Faith Was Most Altered by the Pandemic and How? Tell us, I know this is a huge study, I've read it. Tell us in a nutshell, what did you find out was the answer to this question?
Well, it's interesting, Patricia, because when you look at what causes people to change in life, it's usually something that uh, introduces pain into their life or some kind of a personal crisis. And when we look at the pandemic, for most Americans, it actually turned out to be a personal crisis because it had such dramatic and broad ramifications for who they are and how they live. It affected their work life, it affected their relationships, it affected their finances, it affected, all kinds of things that they were doing, their health in particular. And so, as we did this research, one of the things that we found traditionally is that when people are in a situation of pain or suffering or crisis or persecution, what they tend to do is look to their faith to give them strength and to give them wisdom and to give them guidance to work their way through that situation that they're faced with. But with the pandemic, what we discovered is that most Americans now have had such a shift in their thinking and their lifestyles and their values, their morals, that they no longer turn first to their faith. What they're doing now is turning to their feelings. And so every situation that they would find themselves in, instead of trying to identify what is the truth of this situation, most Americans now say, there is no external truth that I need to be apprised of and that I need to take into account as I develop a solution to my situation. Instead, what they say is, I am my own truth. I'm the only one who can know truth for my life. Nobody has the right to impose truth upon me. There's no document or source of absolute moral truth. Instead, I've got to look inward. I've got to look deep inside myself and try to figure out what's the truth for me. And ultimately, as we've been doing this research over the last 3 or 4 years in particular, what we found is that for most people, that means they lean on their feelings.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's a dangerous situation, of course, because your feelings are constantly changing. And so, nevertheless, that's where America's at now. So instead of turning to a biblical worldview, which would be consistent, constant, reliable, predictable, proven over the course of time, what we found Americans are doing is going back to their feelings, and kind of like the ball in a pinball machine. They're just bouncing off situations, trying to figure out what's best here, what's best there. And there's not even a strong correlation between or relationship between the different things that they believe and do. Often they'll say one thing and do something completely different. There's contradictions in who we've become as Americans. And, that leads to a lot of the confusion and chaos we have in our culture.
Absolutely. And one of the things that you mentioned is that the church, it's like the church didn't know what to do. So you even you said something that I will quote you here. Said the last 3 years have been a time of high anxiety for tens of millions of adults. The ideal time for the Christian church to provide wise guidance and emotional calm. Unfortunately, most churches agreed to the government's dictate that they close their doors and remain mostly silent. They left an unprepared populace to follow the primary form of leadership available to them. So should the conclusion, as we read your words, and I agree, is that the church did not do so well in leading believers right through these trying times of the pandemic. So do you believe that the churches are aware of that? And do you see that the church is working towards repairing some of this damage? If so, how?
I think there's a slowly growing awareness in a certain sector of churches that they blew it during the pandemic. Based on the research that I've done so far, I would say no, most churches do not see it that way. They think that they did the best they could within the limitations that were imposed upon them. And to me, that is indicative of one of the core problems of the institutional church in America today, which is ineffective leadership. Leaders don't let others define who they are. And yet, during the course of the pandemic, we had church leaders who allowed the government, who's not supposed to have much, if any, influence on the definition and the behavior of a church, dictate who the church was, what they could and could not do. And consequently, we had churches going along with the lockdown to the detriment of our entire culture. What we have essentially are Christian churches with people who are masquerading as leaders. They weren't called by God to lead. They're not gifted by God to lead. They're called by God to minister. They're, gifted by him to minister, but not necessarily as leaders. What our research shows is that most of the people who have the position of primary leadership in a church were called and gifted as teachers or preachers or counselors, but not necessarily as leaders. And there's a big difference between being a teacher or a preacher and a leader. Different gift skill, different mindset, different heart. And so what we have is a lot of organizations, institutions, local churches who lack that kind of strong backbone, that kind of visionary, strategic leadership that would enable them to stand up to the government and say, wait a minute, constitutionally, you have no
Exactly.
right to tell us we can or cannot close. We're actually here to serve the people just like you are. And you cannot take that right away from us. We'll live within the boundaries of what are reasonable dictates related to health, but you cannot keep people from practicing and pursuing faith. And so, basically what we have are churches that have the same kind of identity crisis
Hmm.
that so many young people in our culture are going through
Wow.
today as they try to figure out, am I a man? Am I a woman? Am I something
Mhm.
else? And churches in a different way have exactly the same issue that they're struggling with.
It is so true. You're seeing a lot of even known leaders of the church that are coming up with some declarations, some things that they are saying out there that you're like, what's going on? Something shifted in the biblical worldview that some pastors used to really hold on to. You're seeing that shift since the pandemic. It's not just this research shows, the different generations, but I see this shift in the church too, for sure. So,
Well, and that shift started long before the pandemic.
of course.
What the pandemic served as was an accelerator.
Mm,
And so now they had this situation where they had to make a choice. Okay, am I going to be strictly biblical or am I going to be strictly cultural? And you
mhm,
had more pastors and church leaders moving toward, I want to be cultural. I want
mhm.
to, be someone who shows that they understand people's pain, their situation, and I'm going to do the things that make them happy because that's one of the shifts that's taken place over the last 50 years in America
Mhm.
is we've gone from a mindset of success is consistent obedience to God,
Yes.
which is biblical,
Yes.
to a mindset of success is making people happy.
Mm.
And part of the reason for that, we did for several years running, we did national studies with senior pastors of Christian churches across the country and asked them, do you think your church is successful in ministry? And we found that most of them, more than 4 out of 5 of them, said, oh, yeah, we're very successful. So, okay, great. Yeah. On what do you base that judgment? And we found that there are 5 things that most churches measure to determine whether or not they're successful in ministry. How many people show up, how many programs they offer, how many staff people they've hired to facilitate those programs, how much money they raise, and how much square footage they built out on their campus. And the idea is if those 5 numbers are bigger this weekend than they were 52 weekends ago, 1 year ago, then we are what they call a healthy and growing church. The only problem with those metrics, and remember, I'm a measurement guy, so I'm thrilled that they're
Yeah,
measuring stuff,
of
you know.
course.
But what I've also learned over the years is, if you measure the wrong stuff, you'll get the wrong results. And that's what's happening in the church in America because Jesus didn't die for any of those 5 things that they're measuring.
Absolutely.
He didn't die to put butts in seats. He didn't die to fill up a bank account. He didn't die to give churches the biggest real estate portfolio in their community. He died so that people would recognize that they're sinners. They need to ask for his forgiveness, cling to him, completely give themselves over to God and his ways. That's what the life of Christ was about. It wasn't about filling churches, wasn't about popularity, wasn't about fame. And so we've completely lost track. But it's those kinds of success measures that enabled churches in this country during the pandemic to say, you know what, we're going to stand with the people. We're going to do whatever it takes to make them feel comfortable and healthy and happy, as opposed to we're going to serve the Lord our God who has given us this mandate to lead his people to him.
I love that. And you have this quote also that I want you to unpack for us because it goes together with what you're just saying. As a nation, we may be past the danger of COVID-19, but we are in the thick of the danger brought about by people relying upon syncretism as the dominant worldview. Can you talk about this danger that we're facing?
Yeah, this is really important, Patricia, because most people have never heard of syncretism.
Hmm.
They don't know what it is. You read it in a report or a book I write, and your eyes glaze over. It's like, all right, what else has he got? But it's important for people to recognize that right now, about what is it, 94% of American adults have a primary worldview of syncretism. Only 4% have a primary worldview that is the biblical worldview. And
Mm.
then the other 2% are scattered between other worldviews, Marxism, secular humanism, etc. What is syncretism? It basically is saying, I'm not going to adhere to any one coherent, comprehensive philosophy of life. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to rely on my mind and my heart to determine what works best for me, what sounds best, what's most popular, what makes me feel most comfortable or secure, what comes most easily to me, what I see other people doing. And so, what people with syncretism as their dominant worldview do is they draw from elements of all of these other comprehensive philosophies of life, Marxism, secular humanism, pantheism, or Eastern mysticism, and so on. And they don't buy into those lock, stock, and barrel either,
Mm.
but they're just taking the parts of those that they like or that they think are going to work well for them. And they blend them together into this customized worldview that really is their own mixture of ideas. And so one of the challenges for people like me in our university and, pastors and other leaders who want people to understand and embrace a biblical worldview is we can't really get our arms around the worldview of most people because we've got 255 million adults in America. And in essence, because of syncretism, we've got about 255 million different worldviews out there.
Wow.
People have their own mixture of ideas that isn't even the same as somebody else who's a syncretist. So it's
Mhm.
very difficult. If everybody bought into Marxism, we can blow Marxism away. It's a stupid worldview. It doesn't hold water. It's never proven to work.
Mhm.
And, philosophically, we can cut it to shreds. But when you've got so many different approaches, there's not even a viable starting place if you want to take where somebody's at, which is always the best place, rather than me saying, hey, do what I do. No, it's like, I want to know what you do and let's talk about that. Let's have kind of a Socratic conversation about that, where I get
Mm.
to ask you questions about that. But it's hard for people, first of all, to identify what they believe, because one thing that's fascinating to me, Patricia, is that Americans are not deep thinkers. We're
Mhm.
not reflective people. We're people of action. That's
Mhm.
what made America great,
Yeah.
is that we saw opportunities and we jumped at them, we pursued them, and we worked hard and we created more stuff than any other place in the world. You look at all the number of patents and copyrights and everything else, America leads the way because we're creative thinkers, we're aggressive in that sense, but we're not deep thinkers. And
Mm.
so when it comes to something like worldview, what do you believe? Why do you believe it? What are the implications of what you believe? What would happen if you were to change that? How does that comport with what the Bible teaches or what other people believe? We don't even think about those things. We
Mm.
just keep moving through our day, trying to make progress given our identified goals in life, but they don't have anything to do with worldview.
Boy, and do we have a plate full of opportunities to make this trend continue nowadays? Because when you think about especially the younger generations that are so, their noses are on this little devices all day long, just which they are dedicated mostly to superficial things, right? Superficial thinking, right? So the enemy certainly has is having a field day, right, with what our society is offering out there. It is the opposite of this. Wow. But I know that in your research, there is one generation in particular that was highlighted, um, which was the millennium generation, right? So you found that 4% of millennials only have a biblical worldview, the lowest level of biblical worldview understanding of any generation since first measured more than 25 years ago by yourself.
Mhm.
And of course, this is and this research that you've done on millennials, that's another study that you've done has inspired this book, this new book that you just launched in March. Great book. It's called Helping Millennials Thrive. I have three millennial nephews. My kids are little, are the next generation down. But
Yeah, right.
so I'm very interested in this subject because I have seen this, in my own family, them just going farther and farther away from the biblical worldview. So, what have you concluded that has driven this scenario for this huge generation?
Yeah, I mean, they're so vitally important as a generation for many reasons. Certainly they're the largest generation in America's history, but to me, more importantly, they're our primary parenting generation right now.
Mhm.
And so when you look at the influence that they're going to have upon younger children who right now are forming their worldview, which is going to dictate who they become, how they live, their sense of identity, all of these things that are so important to that younger age group. Millennials hold the key to that. So, that's why I think it's important that we recognize if you're a parent, you can't give what you don't have. And knowing that, 96 to 98% of millennial parents do not have a biblical worldview, well, they're not going to give a biblical worldview to
Yeah.
their children. They don't have it to give. And so that says to the rest of us who do have one, even though we typically think, okay, adults are who they are for the rest of their life, let's move on from them. We can't give up on millennials.
No.
First of all, we don't want them to struggle in life, which they will given their existing worldview. But secondly, we don't want them to pollute the minds and hearts and souls of America's children today, because that ultimately will bring upon about the destruction of America. I mean, we're moving in that direction as it is with this, younger generation of children. We don't want that to happen. So it's imperative that we continue to build relationships with millennials, have conversations with them about what they believe, why they believe it, what that looks like in practice, what some biblical alternatives might be, why those are important to consider, all of those kinds of things, which you can only have those conversations when you have a trust-based relationship with them. And you can only have that kind of trust-based relationship with them if you deeply and genuinely care about these folks. And so that's one of the critical challenges to my generation and other generations is, don't abandon millennials because, they've got tattoos and nose rings and, they have different thoughts and they tell you they're insecure and all these things that you think are rubbish. Doesn't matter. That's who they are. That's where they are.
Mhm.
Accept them for where they are, but don't leave them there. Love them enough to embrace them, to care about them, to try to understand them, and do what you can to help them see that there are alternatives to the things that they're struggling with. Most millennials are not happy with their life. Most
Right.
millennials do not feel that the future is a bright one. They're not optimistic.
Mhm.
Most millennials admit openly, as I mentioned in the book, that they're struggling with mental health issues, anxiety, depression, fear, suicidal thoughts, all of these things, highest levels of any generation we've ever seen. And so you don't help them by saying, well, you made your bed, lie in it. No, you come alongside them, you love them, you help them get through that and beyond that. And so much of the solution is going to come back to conversations about worldview. Again, why? Because that's how you make your decisions. And they're struggling in life because they're making bad decisions, but they're making bad decisions because their worldview is wrong.
Absolutely. Wow. And this is a great resource, by the way, for leaders that who are wanting to help this generation, because not only it is filled with Dr. Barna's research on the millennials, but it's also got the insights from several other leaders, because the the objective, the goal of this book is really not just to bring about the, oh, this is what's going on in the heads and in the lives of the millennials, but also understand them and bring together real solutions, right, that you're offering. So tell me how this book offers practical insights, like for churches, for families, for leaders, to help this generation of what I think is Dr. Mansell, she calls the prodigal generation.
Yeah. One of the beautiful things about this book, I talk in there a lot about worldview, but then we've got 11 other Christian leaders who were part of this process with us. And we've done panels in the country talking about what difference this information makes. And they start to talk from a pastor's perspective. We have counselors talk about it from a counseling perspective. We've got other leaders in there talking about it from their perspectives about how do you practically begin to make these changes in their lives. So this isn't just an academic book about here's the data, here are the correlations, here's the stats, et cetera. This really is about, okay, how can we convert that information into practical help for people who right now essentially are crying out for help? When they tell us that they feel insecure, they don't feel healthy, they're struggling for happiness, 75% of them say they don't have any sense of meaning or purpose in their life, which of course raises the question of why get out of bed? And many of them are asking that. And that's why they have the highest suicide rates. I mean, all these things work together. They don't feel like they have good relationships with other people. We've got people in there talking about relationships. Ken Sande, one of the nation's experts on conflict resolution, has a whole chapter about how do you deal with conflict with other people. That's critical. Millennials, based on my previous research, have no clue how to do that. They run from it. They don't want to deal with it. Yeah, it makes them feel uncomfortable and insecure, so they don't want to move toward it. They want to move away from it. So we got Ken to help us, think that through. So I'm excited about the book because it's not just here's the situation. That's important. You can't have strategic thinking unless first you have strategic information. But now that we've got the strategic information, we brought in some great leaders, Che On and Tim Clinton and many others to think through, Sammy Rodriguez, a whole bunch, to think through, how can we apply this now in our context?
I love it. I am all for books. Not only they're filled with great information, but also practical help to those who want to help this generation. So I absolutely love that. And of course, this is just one of so many other books. I have one last question. And it has to do with the issue of the biblical worldview that the world, all generations are struggling with. As you said, we have a huge shift in this, and you've been doing research for long enough to know how far we've come, right, from our beliefs as believers, as Christians. But the one of the people in the book, one of the professionals in the book is Dr. Joanna Diaz, and she is a counselor and she's a millennium herself. And she says that her practice, right, she has several millennials that come to her practice, that she confirms the issues that you have found in the research. And she says this, she says that the issue is basic. Millennials do not know their true identity in Christ. So when I read that, I thought this, I personally believe that this is often the core of a faith crisis to anybody. Anybody that defines a faith crisis in many ways, or cannot change or cannot overcome, is a lot of times the identity is not clear, right? So how is this issue different in your thoughts? How is it different from any other generation for the millennials?
Well,
Millennials.
I'll use this word that has pejorative, feel to it, and I don't mean it to be negative toward millennials, but from all the objective measures we have, they're the most narcissistic generation we've yet seen. And so when your starting point is not that I'm a created being, I'm created with purpose and for a purpose, and my creator gives me that purpose. He loves me, he wants me to succeed, and so he's given me boundaries where if I live within those boundaries, I am going to thrive. When I move outside those boundaries, I'm going to struggle and suffer. I mean, that would be a Christian perspective, but this is a generation that says, I'm not a created being. I'm here by chance.
Mm.
Everything around me is random. There is no absolute moral truth. I'm all alone. I have to make life the best I can make it without being able to rely upon any kind of supernatural guidance or power or traditions. It's all about me. Well, when that's your starting place, that's also going to be your ending place. I mean,
Mhm.
you're not going to get very far beyond that. You are the sum total of who you are simply by yourself. As a follower of Jesus Christ, I am blown away by the fact that I get to relate to my Father in heaven, that I get to rely upon him, that he loves me enough to have given me a set of guidelines for how to succeed in life. And so it's a very different kind of life experience than a typical millennial would have. I feel so bad for them because they're, like floating in space, not going anywhere, not knowing why they're even there, how they got there, where they're going, if they should continue going, as opposed to knowing that God created me for a purpose and he loves me. He's going to support me. He's going to help me and bless me. I mean, two totally different outlooks. So, millennials do struggle with that identity crisis.
Mhm.
But one of the beautiful things, if you look at the Bible, one of the things that Jesus said when he died, at the end of Matthew, he gave us what's known as the Great Commission. Go and make disciples of all the world. And there were 6 places in the New Testament where the people who were following him, he told them, you will be my disciples if. And there are 6 different elements that he gave to them of what it takes to be a true follower of Christ. Why would you do that? Because then you're connected to God and you're tapped into the power of God and the guidance of God. And one of the things he said is, you know what? God comes first. You will be my disciple. When you're willing to essentially hate everything else in comparison to how much you love God. He doesn't call you to hate. He wants you to love other people. But just as a comparison, it's like
Right.
that's how much you have to love God.
Mhm.
And that's what puts you on the right pathway. That's a great starting place.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, that is a great starting place, and that gives hope because it sounds so complicated. It sounds so dim, the scenario in which the society is found. But we also know that with that, we have a God that his path is straight and simple, and I think that this should give us anybody who wants to influence the next generation. Uh, just the hope that it's really not our work, it's the Holy Spirit's work. So it's prayer and just living out the life, because I think that one of the issues with the generation before is that a lot of the millennials have seen this, the parents that they say that they believe this but they live a different way, and kids, they will catch you on inconsistencies like nobody else.
Right.
So there's always that. Like we're seeing the results on the millennials, but we have to really evaluate what did they see, right? What did they experience at home? And I know that your research talks about that too. So, well, what a pleasure to talk to you. It was a treat, really.
Well, thank you.
So
Yeah, I've enjoyed it. I appreciate you having me on the show.
of course, I'm very excited about talking to you and then writing my column for the Atlanta Journal about your work and about this very, very important book for this generation. Are there any last thoughts that I would love for you to encourage a parent out there who is maybe the parent of a millennial who is a prodigal son or daughter? Would you like to leave some last encouraging thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I just finished writing my next book, which is about what parents can do to raise their children to be spiritual champions. And it's important, I think, for all of us to keep in mind as a parent, that's the single most important thing I'm going to do in life. It's not about how much money I make, how big my house is, how many Porsches I have in the driveway. It's about what do I do to develop my children to be Christ-like. How am I facilitating that in their life? And so it is true that children sniff out and observe inconsistencies almost instantly with their parents. But you don't have to have it all together. You're never going to get it all right. But you do have to be consistent in what you're doing. All the research I've done with parents who raised spiritual champions, we asked them, what did you do that was most important? First of all, we asked the children who became adults, and we said, what'd your parents do that was most important? They said they were consistent. If they believed something, I could see it in how they lived. And that was the model for me. And then we asked the parents, what do you think was the most important thing you did to raise someone who became a spiritual champion? And they said, I tried to be consistent. It didn't always work, but more often than not, it did, because I was committed to that. And so I would encourage parents today, know what you believe, know why you believe it, and know how to convert that into a lifestyle that reflects those beliefs. That's the kind of life, and that's the kind of child rearing that God is going to bless. And that's going to produce a child who becomes a spiritual champion in our culture and has a positive impact on America for Christ.
Absolutely. I love that advice. It's on point, of course. Couldn't expect anything less coming from you. So I love that. Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you so much, Dr. Barna. It's been a pleasure talking to you. And I'm excited about this new book. Maybe I'll interview you for this next book as well. So,
Well, look
be,
forward to it. Yeah,
all
great.
right.
Thanks so much, Patricia. Thank you.
Thank you. You have a wonderful day.
You do the same.
Bye.